Okay, so why don't we get started? Welcome, everyone. I'm Susan Peppercorn. I'm an executive and career coach, for those of you who don't know me. And this is one of my favorite topics, how to stop catastrophizing. I have chosen this topic because I am a former catastrophizer, and sometimes I still lapse into it. But it's really important when you do find yourself doing this to learn how to get out of your own way. And that's really the goal of this session, is for me to provide you with some tools to learn how to stop that process of catastrophizing right in its tracks when it happens. And what we're really talking about is one of the tools for developing resilience. And resilience is the ability to bounce back from negative emotions, stressful experiences, and grow from challenges. And being able to stop catastrophizing is a way of developing resilience, and the reason that we're talking about this today. So what exactly is catastrophizing? I would say that everyone who's on this webinar today knows it when you see it. And really, catastrophizing is anticipating a negative outcome to an event. It's jumping to a conclusion that if a negative outcome does happen, it would be a disaster. And assuming that even if that event has not taken place yet, that the worst possible outcome is going to result from whatever it might be. And it's a very common occurrence. So the question is, what causes it? Well, there are three common reasons why we experience catastrophizing. One is ambiguity. So ambiguity, or being vague, can open a person up to catastrophic thinking. So for example, if you get a text message from a friend or a partner that reads, "We need to talk," you know, it's ambiguous. What does that mean? It could be, we need to talk about something positive, or it could be, we need to talk about something because I'm mad at you. But your mind goes to work automatically. And for a lot of us, that means assuming the worst. So ambiguity is one situation where we often find ourselves catastrophizing. It's like, well, what does that friend want to talk about? Or it could be a manager. What does our manager want to talk to us about? Value, or a high value in a relationship, can cause us to catastrophize. So in situations where we hold a person in high value or high esteem, can result in our tendency to catastrophize. So if we apply for a job that we badly want, and then we don't hear anything for a week, for 10 days, what do we assume? We assume they don't want us, they don't need us, we did something wrong. That's when we place a very high value on something, we tend to assume the worst. And fear, especially irrational fear, can play a big role in catastrophizing. So let's say you're scared of going to the doctor, and we're afraid that if we go to the doctor, we're going to hear bad news. So we imagine that if we go to the doctor, what's the doctor going to tell us? The doctor's going to tell us bad news, so we imagine the worst is going to happen. So these are three situations in which we may find ourselves catastrophizing. And if you stop and think for a moment, think about situations where you have found yourself jumping to negative conclusions. And which one of these have been triggers for you? Has it been ambiguity? Has it been a high value situation? Or has it been when you really felt afraid? Because the first key to stopping catastrophizing is noticing when it's going on. So what are some of the consequences of catastrophizing? Well, we may think that, okay, it just leads us to, having a lot of negative thoughts. But really, if it's something that we notice happens to us a lot, it really can result in some fairly significant issues. It could lead to high levels of stress. It could lead to health problems, and it could lead to problems in relationships because, if we're in a close relationship, with a loved one, a partner, and we're constantly telling that person about what we anticipate is going to go wrong, it really wears on the other person if they hear that day in and day out. So we may not realize when we're doing it, but it takes its toll not only on us, but on others around us. So those are some of the consequences. So, catastrophizing falls into what psychologists call thinking traps. And if you look at the cartoon on this slide, and I'll just read the caption and I think you'll get a chuckle out of it. Here's poor Daryl trying to eat cereal or soup or whatever, and look at the direction that his spoon is pointed. And the caption says, Daryl suspected someone had once again slipped him a spoon with the concave side reversed. Well, what is Daryl thinking? Daryl assumes that someone handed him the spoon in the wrong direction. But it's not the event which causes the feeling, it's how you think about it. And so there are 5 different types of thinking traps that we tend to fall into. So the first one of these is mind reading. And mind reading is when we assume that we know what the other person is thinking, or that we expect others to know what we're thinking. And I'm going to show you a video shortly where the person talks about these 5 different types of thinking traps and how to deal with them, including catastrophizing. The second one is the me trap, which is the one that Daryl is in. Believing that, I'm sorry, it's actually the third one. But the me trap is when you believe that you're the cause of your setbacks or problems. I must have done something wrong. I messed up that conversation. I blew that interview. Always thinking that you're the cause of something that went wrong. But in Daryl's case, it's the them trap. It's everyone else's fault. He thinks that someone slipped him the spoon with the wrong side facing up. So that's a them trap where you blame everyone else. And that can be a real problem. And then catastrophizing, which I've already defined and you're familiar with, ruminating about the worst possible outcomes. And then the last one is helplessness, which frequently goes along with catastrophizing, where when you assume that terrible things are going to happen and there's nothing you can do about it. Okay, so what I want to talk to you about is how do you deal with these thinking traps? And there are 3 ways in which you can deal with them. One is with evidence, one is with reframing, and another one is with planning. So let's say that you're catastrophizing and you're saying, You know, I'm never going to get that job. You know, everyone else is more qualified than I am. It's never going to be, it's never going to go my way. So you can use evidence as a way of dealing with that level of catastrophizing, because let's say you have the qualifications to get that job. And you can say to yourself, with the example that you see on the right side of the screen, that's not true because I have 15 years of experience in the area that this employer is looking for. And so I know that I have the qualifications to meet what this employer is looking for. So you can counter your catastrophizing with evidence. So that's one way that you can deal with this. A second way in which you can deal with catastrophizing is to use a technique called reframing. So reframing is a way in which you say to yourself, a more helpful way to see this situation is. So instead of immediately jumping to the worst possible case scenario is, which is where your mind tends to go, you can say to yourself, wait a minute, a more helpful way to see this situation is the following. And think of a more helpful way in which you can reframe that particular situation. And then the third way of dealing with catastrophizing or other thinking traps is planning. So let's say you don't know an answer to a question. Let's say you've given a presentation and somebody asks you a question and you don't know the answer. You can say, okay, if you anticipate that's going to happen, you can say, well, if somebody asks me a question and I don't know the answer, I can get back to them. So that's what planning is. So these are three techniques that you can use to deal with thinking traps. And these are called real-time resilience responses that you can use to stop yourself when you find yourself dealing with these situations. So I'm going to show you now a brief video. You're going to see Karen Rivich. She is a professor at the University of Pennsylvania, and she teaches resiliency. She runs a program actually for the U.S. Army, where she teaches professionals in the Army. Oops, let me stop this for a second. And she teaches resiliency to members of the military who obviously deal with very difficult challenges all of the time. And they need to be able to build their resiliency. What she's talking about in this video specifically were some challenges that she was dealing with in terms of her own thinking errors. And she is going to walk you through some thinking traps of her own and how she dealt with them. So the thing that I want to say to you here is that even professionals like a PhD psychologist who teaches resiliency, often in their own world, when they're dealing with stress, find themselves falling into thinking traps, including catastrophizing. So let's see what she has to say.
Of a situation where I was absolutely falling into thinking traps, the stakes were high, it mattered to me, I really wanted to do well. And so I used the skill of real-time resilience to quiet all that mental chatter and get my focus and energy where I needed it to be. So here's the situation. I had just flown out to California to spend the day with some very, very, very senior leaders in a very, very fast-paced and successful organization. And it was my first time being with that organization. I had some phone calls, but this was the first time where I was going to face-to-face have about a half day with this group of very senior leaders.
Sorry. Let me start that again.
So let me give you an example of a situation where I was absolutely falling into thinking traps. The stakes were high. It mattered to me. I really wanted to do well. And so I used the skill of real-time resilience to quiet all that mental chatter and get my focus and energy where I needed it to be. So here's the situation. I had just flown out to California to spend the day with some very, very, very senior leaders in a very, very fast-paced and successful organization. And it was my first time being with that organization. I had some phone calls, but this was the first time where I was going to face-to-face have about a half day with this group of very senior leaders. I knew, that the presentation would determine whether there was going to be ongoing engagement or if this was a one and done and thanks, but no thanks. So, I wanted to do well. The audience was filled with these senior folks and, clearly they had given up a big chunk of their day to spend with me and to hear about what I do. So that's all kind of whirling around in my brain. On top of that, I had been doing a lot of resilience training right up until this trip. So it was sort of like the Resilience Roadshow. And I was quite honestly starting to feel a little run down, a little tired about talking about resilience. And so I started to feel a little frayed around the edges. So you had that going on. And then finally, you've heard me talk about my husband, Guy. He also has an incredibly busy career. He travels a lot too. And we have 4 kids. So there's a lot going on the home front. I got, Aaron, who you've met, and Jacob for the first year of college. I've got a senior in high school. And then our daughter, Shayna, is in 7th grade. So the truth is when I'm traveling, it puts a little extra stress on everyone. And that was kind of rattling around upstairs as well. So you got the situation. Now what I'm going to do is I'm going to articulate what my counterproductive thoughts were driven by those thinking traps. And then I'm going to stop. We'll label what the counterproductive thought was, and then I'll model the skill of real-time resilience for you. So watch closely, pay attention to what I'm doing, because after I'm done this, you're going to try it out yourself. Okay, so here we go. First counterproductive thought. I'm about to open the door to go into the room. I'm about to, stand in front of the podium in this, big theater, lots of people. And my thought is, this is going to be such a disaster. I don't know enough about this industry. I mean, it's going to be completely clear that I'm way over my head. They're going to ask questions I don't know the answer to. I'm totally going to crash and burn up here. Okay. Catastrophizing. You could hear like the runaway train starting to run away. So now let me model real-time resilience. All right. That's not true, because in the last 6 months alone, I've given 6 talks to various groups of people. And if I don't know the answer to certain questions, I can acknowledge that and call them or email them later with an answer. All right, so that was the real-time resilience response. You probably noticed that in that one answer, I actually used 2 different strategies, right? I used evidence, right? I said, in the last 6 months, I've given 6 talks. That's pretty vivid, right? I'm not just saying it's going to go fine. I'm anchoring it to discrete data. 6 months, 6 talks, various groups. And by having that very detailed evidence, I believe it, and it starts to push away all that catastrophic thinking. You also probably noticed me using the strategy of plan. I said, if I don't know an answer to a question, I can acknowledge it and tell them I'll email or call them with an answer. And that's a contingency plan. And by having a plan, the anxiety starts to recede. Okay, so that was one demonstration. Let's do another counterproductive thought, because I don't just have one counterproductive thought. I get a whole bunch at a time. So here's the next one. Traveling like this is so unfair to Guy. When I'm on the road, he's got to deal with all of the kids. It's selfish of me to be out here in California. There's so much stuff that needs to be taken care of at home. Okay, which trap was that? Right, that was the me trap, right? I'm saying I'm the sole cause, I'm selfish, I'm blaming myself. And that's probably going to generate some guilt, maybe starting to feel sad. That's not what I want to be feeling right before I make a presentation. So, real-time resilience response. Come on, Karen. A better way of seeing this is, Guy and I both love our careers. And when one of us is away, the other is at home, taking care of what's going on. That's what makes our marriage strong. Okay. So what strategy did I use? I used the strategy of reframe, right? I said a better way of seeing this is, and then I reframed it by pointing out a more optimistic way of viewing the situation. That when I'm on the road, Guy takes over the home front. When he's on the road, I hold down the fort. Good. Let's do a third thought. So here's my third counterproductive thought. Oh, come on, let's face it. These are busy people. They are not going to respect what I have to say. They're going to think I'm a total joke. Okay. What thinking trap was that? That was a trap of mind reading. I don't know what they're thinking. I don't know if they think I'm a joke or not, but I was in the trap of mind reading. So let me use a real-time resilience response or strategy to fight off that counterproductive thought. Here we go. All right, they're busy people, but it's not true that they think I'm a joke. They invited me to this presentation, so they clearly think I have valuable information to share. All right, so I use the strategy of evidence to prove to myself that that mind reading was likely inaccurate. And by using evidence, I was able to kind of settle down, to feel a little more confident, and to be ready to engage in the presentation. So you just heard me fall into 3 different thinking traps and then use 3 different strategies to fight them off. I was catastrophizing, I was mind reading, I was in the me trap. And the truth is, I'd be lying to you and to myself if I said I never fall in those traps. I still do occasionally. And that's the beauty of the skill real-time resilience, that by learning how to use evidence, that's not true because, by learning how to reframe, a better way of seeing this is, and by learning how to plan, if X happens, I will Y, by using those strategies of real-time resilience, in the very moment you're starting to slip into the trap, you can pull yourself out again so that you're able to handle situations more effectively, more productively, and enhance your general confidence, and I would say resilience.
So there you saw, I think a great example of, someone, again, who's teaches this for a living, lives it for a living, who herself falls into some of those thinking traps that we all tend to fall into now and then. So one of the things that I want to say about resilience in general is that our goal is to find a balance between stress and protective factors. We can't eliminate stress from our lives. Wouldn't that be wonderful if we could? But it's not a realistic expectation. So the goal in learning how to deal with these thinking errors is to be able to build up the protective factors so that when our stress is increased for whatever reason, we have tools in our toolkit to be able to better deal with that stress. So if you look at this worksheet, this is here and really as a summary to help you think about what it is that you can say to yourself when you find yourself catastrophizing. So I just want to walk through this for a moment. So as I said earlier, if you, the first part and probably the most important part is to notice yourself actually when that train starts to run away, as Dr. Rivich said. Do you notice when that train has, sped off, has sped up so far that it's a problem? So the first thing is to ask yourself, what is the catastrophe that I'm worried about? And following that, how likely is this event to happen? And there are some follow-up questions that you can ask yourself. Has anything this bad ever happened to you before? How often does this kind of thing happen to you? So if you're assuming the worst, ask yourself, is this frequent? Does this happen often? And realistically, how likely is it to happen now? Okay, so that's the first part. Secondly, let's say the worst case scenario. If it did happen, what's the worst case scenario? What's the best case scenario? And what do you think if you imagine that you were telling your friend about it? What would your friend tell you to do? What would your friend say to you about your worry? And then if the worst did happen, what would you do to cope? So if anything similar had happened to you before, how did you cope? Because it's important when you are imagining the worst possible scenario to remind yourself how you have dealt with difficult situations in the past. Because the reality is we all have, at some point in our lives, dealt with difficult situations. So if we've gotten through them in the past, we can get through them in the future. And what resources do you have? In other words, who or what could you call on to help you get through it? And what resources, skills, or abilities would be helpful to you if it did happen? So think of this as a worksheet that you can use should you find yourself in a catastrophizing mode where you're jumping to the worst possible conclusion. So this is, in a nutshell, some strategies to help you stop catastrophizing in its tracks and to not make it a habit. And that's one of the things that I do want to mention to you, that if you find that this kind of behavior is something that, a pattern that you fall into fairly regularly, then you have to give yourself some time to get out of that behavior and change that behavior. Usually it takes somewhere between a month and 3 months to change a habit that is formed. So if you find yourself practicing some of these strategies that you learned today, don't expect this to change overnight. Give yourself at least a few weeks to try and practice it over and over again before you notice a difference, because it does take time for a new habit to form. So I hope this has been helpful to you. Here are some ways that you can connect with me. And certainly if you have any questions about what I've talked about today, please feel free to email me. And if you have any questions, I'd be happy to take a few now. Feel free to chat into the to type into the chat box.